QSO Today, episode 517, Willi Kraml, OE1WKL. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. I want to thank the following recurring donations and listener sponsors: Wade Bryan, KD5PLG, Todd Mitchell, N0IP, Joey Smith, N4VFA, Mark Farrell, VK6OP, J. Gordon Betty Jr., W2TTT, Bill Pitchman, W8LV, and Adrian Lambert, M5ADL. There was a donation from a good friend, Deb Webster, for $25. She's not a ham, but still a supporter. There were anonymous donations and recurring sponsorships the last 2 weeks, and you know who you are. Thank you for your support. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. As I said last week in an email to my list, the confluence of events prevented me from publishing a podcast, breaking my almost 10-year streak of never missing an episode. I appreciate all of the kind messages and guest suggestions that were sent and received. And while I've tried not to repeat episode guests, it seems like this strategy neglects the amazing and interesting things that my former guests do after the interview. So I will bring back some of the previous guests to find out what they are doing now. My guest this week is Willi Kraml, OE1WKL, creator of the Morserino CW code practice machine. Willi discovered amateur radio as a boy in Linz, Austria, but had to wait until the legal age of 16 to get his license. With his doctorate in linguistics, Willi pursued a career in IT security with KPMG, and when his local makerspace needed an Arduino project around amateur radio, the Morserino code practice machine was born. OE1WKL discusses the delivery of over 10,000 Morserino kits, his projects, and contributions to amateur radio in this QSO Today. OE1WKL, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Willi?
Yes, I'm here. Have a good day, Eric. 4ZU1G from OE1WKL.
Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast, Willi. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? Where and when did it start for you?
It started at a very early age. In reality, I was probably around maybe 11 or 12 years old when I became interested in radios as a broadcast receiver. Yeah, my parents had two sets. One, a very old one, in the kitchen. It was a German Volksempfänger. And the other one, a bit more modern, still, we are talking about 1960, 1964, something like that. Still tube-based, of course, not solid state. I was very interested in listening to radio, but the thing that sort of got on my nerves, I was not allowed to touch these radio sets. So I couldn't tune to another station or anything.
Why do you think that was? Was it because your parents had preferred radio stations that they wanted to listen to?
Yeah, probably, yes. And they were probably afraid that make so many changes to their settings that it takes them a while to get back to normal.
You grew up in Linz, Austria, right?
Near Linz, in Upper Austria, yes.
It's the only place in Austria I've ever been, Linz. Was shortwave listening on these radios something that Europeans did more than, say, AM broadcasts?
No. It was strictly AM local stations that they were listening to. But especially with the old set in the kitchen, the Volksempfänger, it was not very narrow-banded. So in the evening, you sometimes heard other stations coming through, DX stations on AM coming through. And that interested me a lot. And I wanted to tune to them, but my parents didn't allow that. But they realized that I'm very interested in this kind of technology. And at Christmas, they gave me an electronics kit as a present. And it was a Cosmos Radioman, which was a really very instructive set of electronic parts. It had all sorts of things in it. You even had to build your own electrolytic capacitor. There was a sort of a kit for a variable capacitor. There were a few resistors and a coil that was wound on, it looked like a toilet paper roll, that a paper roll with wire around it. And it had a very good instruction manual, and it was explaining all the parts and how they work in very simple terms so that a 10 or 12-year-old boy could really understand them. And so I could build first the detector receiver. It was the first project, more or less, with headphones. And now for the first time, I could tune the different stations. So that was exciting. And then the next stage was solid state with a transistor. You could amplify the detector output, or you could even build a regenerative receiver. And all of a sudden on AM, we could hear really distant stations at night. So that was exciting. And there was even an add-on where you could build a sort of a little amplifier with a tube, a battery-powered tube. So you had 13, 14 volts as anode voltage and 4.5 volts for the heater. And it was all very exciting technology. And that's how I really got into it. And so I also acquired books on flea markets, etc., about building radios and how they work and how electronics work. And I started experimenting with the parts I had in the kit. I got a second kit, I think a year later. It was from Philips. It was not so much radio-based as the first one, but more electronics-based. So you could build multivibrators and things that blink or beep or whatever. And I started experimenting and built also the first oscillators on the AM radio band, of course, because that's what the coil and the capacitor I had. So I built an oscillator, and when I tuned to it, I could hear it in the kitchen radio, very much to the annoyance of my parents,
So you could take over everything they're listening to.
That's right, That was very fascinating.
Did you have peers who shared this interest with you?
Not at this stage yet, but my father had a friend, and his friend was a policeman. And the policeman, of course, knew about the legal regulations and said, well, it's not strictly legal to build an oscillator and start transmitting in your neighborhood, But there is something like ham radio, and he had a friend. And I said, I will introduce you to him, that he will teach you everything that you need to know. And you could become a ham radio operator. And so he introduced me to his friend, which was Norbert, OE5 Uniform November. And he had a huge shack really in his basement and a huge antenna outside. For me, it was huge. It was just, 30 meters of wire. But for me, it was enormous. And so this was the first ham I really met in my life. And he explained to me, and he showed me some the equipment he had in his shack, and he explained certain things to me. The only thing that I didn't like, because I was very keen, I said, well, I want to take this license immediately. So he said, well, that's not really possible, because at that time you had to be 16 years of age. And I was just 14 by then, 14 and a half maybe. So you have to wait until you are 16. And then he said, well, even then it's too early. First you have to start being an SWL. You have to do a lot of listening. You have to learn code. You have to learn this and that before it makes sense to go for your exam. So that was a bit of a downer, so to say. But he gave me a VHF receiver and a 2-meter antenna. And this VHF receiver, the make was Nogoton. Never heard about this later. It was tube-based and AM only, 2-meter AM only. But it allowed me to listen to all the local hams. Yeah? And 2-meter, everything was AM back then, pretty much everything. So I could listen to them. And before you know it, I knew all those by call sign and name. I've never seen any one of those men, but I knew all them by call sign and name. From this friend of my father, who was the policeman, he gave me all the legal regulations, all copies of all the laws and regulations. So I was sort of learning them by heart. And then I decided, well, I don't really, as soon as I'm 16, I will go for the exam. And that's what I did when I was 16. I booked an exam, and I went there, completely self-taught, really.
Did you do that in Linz, or did you actually have to go to some capital city?
No, in Linz. They had an office in Linz, so I went there. I had to get permit from the school because it was on a school day in the morning, so I had to get an exemption. The teacher was not very amused. I said, that's all nonsense. What are you doing there? So I went there, did the exam, and passed. I passed because there was just maybe a year before they introduced a no-code option where you could take the exam without Morse code, and this would limit you to VHF and above. Yeah, that was the downside of it. No shortwave. But as I was really listening to VHF, I had plans to start with VHF anyway. So I, when I was 16, I had the license. I went back to this first Elmer, to Norbert, and said, hey, listen, see, I have got my license. I didn't wait any longer.
Were there different levels of exams in Austria at that time?
Only two classes, so to say. One with Morse code and one without. But all the other areas, technology, etc., operating techniques, legal requirements, was all the same for both classes.
So your first license allowed you to have full operation on all the pans?
Yes. Just on VHF and above.
Oh, VHF and above, I see.
VHF and above, because I didn't do the Morse test. And then quickly after that, I got introduced to a local radio club in Linz, the Radio Club 68. It was called like that because it was formed in the year 1968. And I became a member of them. And I got my real Elmers there for the first time. The Peter, OE5, Mike Papa Lima, and Ossi, OE5, Bravo Oscar Lima. The Ossi became my CW teacher then. So he trained me 1-to-1 for about a year. And then I did my CW test and got the full license a year later. And Peter, he introduced me to VHF contesting, 2-meter contesting. He had a nice little contest station up on a hill above Linz. And so with the club call, so to say, we took part in essentially all VHF contests that were on. And we were quite successful, really. So that was interesting. So, yeah, this is how my career started.
Can we talk a little bit about your schooling in Linz? Now, it's my understanding from actually interviewing other ham radio operators from Europe that your school kind of went off in different tracks, like a college track or a technical track in high school. Did that happen there in Austria, and which track did you take?
Of course, there were several different types of school or types of high school, and I went to what we called a humanistic track or the humanistic high school, which so you basically you started your language training with Latin at the age of 10. 2 years later, you started with Old Greek. And only at the age of 15, I started with English. So that was a bit of a downside. I learned English very late in my life, I must say.
You actually had exposure to the classics then in Latin and Greek.
That's right, yeah. And not much to technology. I mean, I was always interested in technology when I went to school. but we didn't hear much about it at school. That was really all self-taught. I was reading magazines about it and things like that. Yeah.
How did ham radio then influence the direction that you went after high school? Did it influence your college or any further education?
Yeah, at first it seemed like it, because at first I thought, well, maybe let's go to technical university and maybe become a radio engineer or something like that. But then I realized when I started at the Technical University of Vienna, I realized that the type of high school I went to was not really the best preparation, because nobody expected me to know anything about the classics, but they expected a lot more in mathematics and geometry and things like that. Especially geometry was an interesting case. I had to do sort of the high school finishing exam. I had to do that at the university because I didn't have it at high school. And so I went to an extra class to learn all that, and that was easy. I passed with flying colors that. So I understood all the principle of geometry. But then at the technical university, you had to have your projects, and you had to draw them by hand with ink, etc. And I hated it, yeah, because it took me so much time. And whenever I was almost finished, there was a blob of ink on the paper or whatever, yeah. And whenever I had finished it, more or less, and I went to the guy examining it, he said, "Oh, that's not good enough. It's correct from the way how you draw it, but in the style of drawing and the neatness is not good enough." And so we ripped it up, and I had to do it again. So I decided, well, that's probably not the life I want to live. And I changed. I went to the University of Vienna and started to study Germanic languages and linguistics. Total change, but which was more fitting to what I knew from high school, of course. Yeah.
You have a PhD, is that correct?
That's right. And it's in linguistics, comparative linguistics.
So what did you do after that? What did you do for making your living?
First, and this started while I was still working on my PhD thesis, I got a job at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. They had a project, a linguistic lexicon project, really, collecting old Germanic names that are in Roman inscriptions and whatever, and with Roman or Latin authors, history books from ancient times. They were collecting all these names into a lexicon, and they hired me as a helper in this project with a requirement to learn programming. As I was interested in things like that already, I said, well, that cannot be a problem. I will learn programming, and I did. Again, more or less self-taught. I started with COBOL on the mainframe. So I did all the IT, the database stuff for this project, and I had this job for, I think, about 5 years, until the project was finished and the book was published, etc. And after that, the question was, what do you do now? Yeah, it's in linguistics, that the area I specialized in was Celtic languages, early Irish, early Welsh, and things like that. So not easy to make a living with this knowledge, unless you're lucky and find a job at a university. But there are not that many jobs, especially in these fields. So I decided, well, during my project, I learned a lot about computers and computing, and even I started to build my own home computer, from scratch, really, more or less, soldering all the components on a PCB. So I said, well, I know pretty much about that, and this is an area that is really going strongly. So I went into IT, more or less. Yeah.
You actually ended up working for quite a time for one of the big 5 international firms, right?
That's correct, yeah.
What company was that?
That was KPMG International. First, I worked for KPMG in Austria, for the Austrian firm. Was head of IT there. Was one of the Austrian internet pioneers in the commercial field. I think our company was among the first 5 companies having a permanent connection to the internet in Austria. And because of that, connecting to internet, I got very much interested in information security, network security, things like that. So I specialized on that. And then with KPMG International, I was for many years their global information security officer.
And I think when you're referring to an early connection to the internet, there was a connection that connected universities around the world.
Yes. And this is how I became exposed. Even during my project at the university, I was a heavy user of the computing facilities of the university. And so I realized, then the first thing they had was global email, yeah, still based on UCP back then, yeah. And then later on, they changed it to SMTP and the more modern protocols. So I was very interested in all this technology. And I said, well, this is so useful for the academic field. Yeah, all of a sudden, people can exchange ideas, and there are FTP servers where you can have repositories of your information and things like that. So that must be interesting for the commercial area as well.
What was the name of that network? Do you recall? It wasn't Usenet?
Usenet was one part of it. Usenet was sort of the knowledge and repository plus use groups.
I remember when I was in college, but it was one of these things that there was a priesthood at every university that actually had access to this network. So it was talked about in very quiet language that it was there, but it wasn't probably until the mid-90s when actually the internet started to kind of turn into the World Wide Web.
Yeah.
How did ham radio play a part in all of this during these years? Were you active in those days?
Not very active, because I was already married by then. I'm married when I still was at university, working for my PhD. I had children, so I had a family. I had a job and I had to learn a lot ongoing for my job. So I was not very active. In the beginning years while I was still at university, I was active with my club in Upper Austria. I still continue to do some contesting and things like that. And I also used their shortwave station when I was up there and did some DXing on shortwave. But with the family and then the job, it was more and more complicated. I always had some radio set. I never became completely silent, but it was really on a side burner, I must say. It just didn't have the time.
I've been there and done that. I had a Motorola MSS. I loved doing radios all day long, but coming home and playing on amateur radio was not one of the things was a popular choice with the family. So I get all that. So what's the status now? Are you retired?
Yes, I retired about 10 years ago from my job. Then I said, well, I have so many interests besides ham radio. Yeah, I'm keen.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. What are those other interests besides amateur radio?
Photography, painting, singing, music in general. And so I knew that I wouldn't be bored when I retire. I had many projects that were sort of on the waiting list to be done. The other thing is also genealogy, to explore the roots of my parents a bit more. And that's a very time-consuming hobby if you start that.
I have a sense of it. Your linguistics background and obviously your IT background, does that play into any of these things like photography?
Yes, sure.
You're a Renaissance man for all intent purposes, would you say?
No, it certainly played a role, yeah, because many things they become different when you have a technological background, so to say, and you can use tools that maybe other people struggle using it because they don't have the background. So, yeah, that always played a role. And then when I retired, I said I also want to become more active as a ham. And I did two things that really made a big difference. The one was I went to our national society, the Österreichische Versuchssenderverband.
Is that the same as the Austrian Experimental Transmitter Association?
Yes.
That's kind of the Austrian version of the ARRL?
That's right, yeah. Has a strange name for historic reasons.
So you went there, and what happened?
And I went there, and because I have been a member all those years, and I saw in their monthly newspaper that they were looking for someone to help them with their website. So I said, well, I want to become more active anyway. Can I help you with the website? I have a little bit of technology background. I'm not a web designer or per se, but I probably know enough to be of some help here. I helped the guy who was responsible for this, and after about a month, he said, well, you know everything now. I'm old. You do it by yourself.
So you ended up taking this job over.
Yeah. So this was one thing, and but the thing was, this was close to the 90-year jubilee of our society. And then they said, well, 90 years coming up, we should do a complete makeup of our website on that occasion. So I said, okay, new version of software, everything new. They said, okay, when should it be ready? Oh, they said, 2 or 3 weeks from now.
And did you pull it off?
Yes, thankfully, I found another guy within our club. For about 2 weeks, we did nothing else, day and night, but setting up a new website, converting thousands of pages, writing new pages, doing, I don't know what, yeah. And we delivered, yeah.
How many hams are in Austria?
There are about 4,000 to 5,000. There are about 6,000 licenses, but this includes, of course, repeater licenses and automated stations of some form, and club licenses, so the licenses not to individuals but to club stations. So it's about close to 5,000 probably.
Do you have a sense of how many of those are active?
Maybe a third of them.
And do you attend a regular amateur radio club meeting?
Yes, I do. That was the other thing. There is the way our club is organized, we have local clubs, so to say, that are all under the umbrella of the National Society. And here in Vienna, there is also one club which I became. I was introduced to it through a QSO really, and that there was a YL who said, "Well, that's you're doing interesting stuff. I'm here with a local club. Won't you come and look what we are doing?" And so I did, and it was the club within what they call MetaLab. MetaLab is a hacker space, maker space, literally in the underground because it is in a basement. But I also do some underground work, so to say. Yeah, it's an interesting group, mostly young people, and they have a ham radio group. They have bi-weekly meetings, and sometimes people come up with interesting lectures and talks about what they are doing and what they're planning to do. And so I became active in this group as well. And this really was the spark for the Morserino project.
One of the reasons that we're speaking with Willi is because Willi is the inventor of the Morserino, and I happen to have one over my right shoulder here, and Willi has lots of them, probably. Can we talk about the Morserino? It appears to me that, and I'll put a link in the show notes page, that you kind of started this project in terms of the funding of this project using a Kickstarter campaign. But how did that start? How did this idea for the Morserino actually become a project that you wanted to pursue?
Yeah, that's an interesting story, really, because in this group within the MetaLab, we were preparing for a maker fair in Vienna. It was the second maker fair that was taking place in Vienna. And they said, well, we want to be there, we want to be present there, and we want to do something that is interesting. So, of course, we would show a ham radio station, we'd string up some wire and do some QSOs there. But we also want to do something more active for people who are interested to do more than just looking at someone operating a radio station.
So something interactive.
So, yeah, or as a kind of a workshop, so to say. Yeah, and so we were brainstorming what can we do. And, well, there was a workshop program for the Maker Fair, but it was sort of restricted to 1-hour workshops. It was restricted financially so that the material should not cost more than, let's say, 40 euros or something like that. And it was restricted to the number of participants, 10 people maximum, yeah, because of space requirements. So we said, yeah, to do some electronics soldering projects maybe would be nice. You can do something easy within an hour, even if people are completely new to that. But then I said, yeah, but what? What to build in the time of an hour? I said, yeah, you can do a blinking light or something like that, but people are happy they finished something and it's blinking, and they take it home, and then they put it in a drawer, and nobody will ever look at it anymore. Yeah? And at that time, I had started to look at Arduinos, and the Arduino Nano had come out and was a very cheap version of the Arduino. And I was sort of experimenting how I could use the Arduino for ham radio. And one of my things I had already started was to build a keyer, a Morse code keyer with the Arduino. So I said, well, let's build something like that. Just a few parts, a loudspeaker, the Arduino, a display, a rotary encoder, and maybe 2 capacitive touch paddles. And we have a simple keyer, and it is something people can actually use for something. Yeah? And we had 2 months' time to set up this project. So together with another ham, we sat down. I did the prototype of that keyer within 2 weeks with an Arduino, touch pedal, everything. The colleague of mine, he did the PCB for it and acquired all the parts. And then we said, well, how many kits are we setting up here? Yeah, he said, well, 10. We would have maximum of 10 people. If 10 are interested in the first place. If only 5 show up, then it's 5. So we should have 10 kits. I said, maybe 10 is not really enough. Maybe we should do more because the price comes down a little bit if we make 20 PCBs and not just 5 or 10. And I said, yeah, but what are we doing with those We said, well, we make a workshop here in the Meta Lab, and we will find another 10 people to build this. Yeah. So we set up 20 kits, and then we were waiting for the workshop, and 35 people were showing up, and 25 had to be turned away. But from those 25, 10 were lucky because they had the option at least to buy the kit material. So all the kits were gone. All the 20 kits were gone, and this friend of mine, he ordered, in total, I think, almost 200 of these kits and sold them in the following months.
For the time, it was a simple keyer.
Yeah, it was a simple keyer. It had a few more features. It could generate automated Morse code for training. It was sort of really a predecessor of the Morserino 32. We had called it Meta Morserino because it was a Meta Lab, and Morserino for Morsing, and Arduino was in there. And I showed this to a ham in Styria in province OE6, and he is a Morse code teacher, and he was very interested in it, and he looked at it. I gave him one of these things, and then he came back and said, that's an interesting project, but it doesn't do enough. To be useful for people learning Morse code, it has to be able to do this and that, and maybe that, and this and that. So I looked at all these things and said, in principle, it can be done, but not with an Arduino. The Arduino is just not powerful, doesn't have enough memory, isn't fast enough. It just doesn't cut it. But I can have a look and see if I find something that is a bit more powerful and that I can do that. And so I was looking around and trying to find modules that would be suitable. And found this Heltec module that had a display on it already, which was nice. It also had Wi-Fi, which was nice. Also had LoRa, which was new to me. I said, maybe, it's a kind of radio. Maybe we can use it as well. It comes with the module anyway. And so I started building a prototype, and we were at the ham radio in Friedrichshafen, the upcoming ham radio. This Morse code teacher was giving a lesson about learning Morse code, and we showed this prototype of this Morserino. And there were so many people interested in that, so we collected email addresses. I said, okay, I set up a mailing list, and if there's any progress, if the prototype comes near to a finished product, I will let you know, and we'll see how it goes. And my estimate back then was that I had maybe 150 people on the mailing list. I said, maybe we can make 200 kits or something like that, or maybe 300. But how to finance it? I said, well, if we cannot at least make 100 kits in the beginning, it's just not worthwhile because the expenses would be too high just for the parts, etc. So I had the idea to do a Kickstarter experiment, and I announced it that I will do financing through Kickstarter. I announced it on the mailing list, and it gave the date and time when it would be possible to sign up for it. And my financial goal was 6,000 euros. Because I said with 6,000 euros, I can at least have 100 kits or so. That would be fine. Now I had, when the date came and Kickstarter went live, I had the 6,000 euros within 3 hours. And after 9 days, that was the period the campaign was running. After 9 days, I had 18,000 euros. So I said at least 300 kits. And so I ramped up my estimate and said, well, we probably can sell 600 of those in the long run. Yeah. And so I assembled the first kits and shipped them out. And without actually further marketing, just those people who got the first kits and showed it around and made YouTube videos of it and or mentioned it in a podcast or on their blog or whatever, yeah, it started growing and growing. And now in August, just a few weeks ago, I jumped over the 10,000 hurdle, 10,000 Morserino kids.
I hope that you have a nice operating margin on it so that it's funding your retirement or something like that.
No, it's not, the margin isn't that big. It's not my goal to make money with that, never was. I'm getting a pension, I can live comfortably of it, so I don't need, it just finances a bit of my hobby, let's put it that way. So previously, if I wanted a new transceiver, I had to discuss it with my wife and say, well, how does it fit into the family budget? Now I just say, well, that fits into the Morserino budget. I buy it.
Staying on the Morserino, I have one here, and it does everything. It slices, it dices, it makes julienne fries for those people that used to stay up late at night in America and look at the device that does everything. It does everything for CW training. But I get a sense that, for me anyway, that I'm somehow using it wrong. I know all my letters. I've known them for 50 years. I want to build my receive speed. The problem is, and it's not a problem, but CW Ops says you don't want to write anything down because you want to be able to do head copy.
Yeah.
So what's the best way using the Morserino? If you already know your letters, you can actually go along at 5, 6, 8 words a minute, but you want to build up speed. How should the Morserino be used to build up speed?
I would say once you know all your letters, the best way is to use the Echo Trainer. You can start with things that are familiar, like English words, the most common English words, or the most common ham radio abbreviations. And you can limit the length of these words. So say, give me just words that are 3 letters long, which is easier to remember. And you should start with at least, I would say, 15 words per minute as a speed.
Just to kind of fill in the gaps here, the Echo Trainer setup allows you to choose what characters are sent to you and how. So right now I've been playing with it with random characters, and some of those random characters also include punctuation marks and abbreviations for things. So if that's too confusing, for me that's a little confusing, then I can actually go to simple words like 8 and eat and 3-letter words.
Yeah, that's right. You have all options. Also random characters you can limit to say just alphabetical characters or alphabetical characters plus numbers. So you can build up from the more common things to the more exotic things. You can also use text and upload a text file to the Morserino, and it will play the text file. So like an audio book in Morse code. Yeah.
How about call signs? If I want to echo test call signs,
there is also a call sign mode, which sort of generates artificial call signs. They're not real life call signs. They look like real life call signs though, and you can use those. Also, starting with say limit them to 3 letters only, and then go to 4 and then to 5. Start with short ones, and once your memory is sort of ready for it, go to longer ones.
I've been recently playing with this echo mode because I wasn't feeling with a CW generator, for example, that it was giving me, I could copy it in my brain, but it wasn't going back to my hand. What was interesting about the echo mode is you actually have to know what the letters are in order to be able to repeat them, because you kind of have to say it in your head in order to be able to send it properly. Have I got that right in terms of how that echo mode works?
That's right, yeah. It provides a challenge. And in a way, that's my experience with people who do it. It's also, they see it as a game, and it is a bit of it. It is addictive in a way. You don't want to stop. Just another word, and maybe not another one, and another one. And you can, if this is not enough challenge for you, you can also set it in a way that if after each correct answer, it ramps up the speed. So it goes maybe from 15 words per minute to 16 words per minute. And if your next answer is correct, it goes up to 17 words per minute. Again, if your answer is wrong, it goes back down again. So you are really approaching your limits all the time. Yeah.
One of the things I've noticed about it is it's not very forgiving when you're sending code into it in terms of if you're reproducing a word or a phrase. Is that adjustable? Can you adjust the Morserino for kind of the weight of your fist?
Not really, and that's on purpose. It is a very strict taskmaster, a very strict teacher, because I think if a machine cannot decode your code, your fist, then many other hams will also not be able to decode it. They will be maybe a bit more forgiving. They have more context than a machine usually has, and so they can infer what you might have meant. But it's better when you are learning to get a feeling for the timing, a strict feeling for the correct timing. And especially, I mean, if you use a straight key, you will never hit it 100% probably, but it should be strict enough so that a machine can decode it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes you a very fine CW operator. Could we talk a little bit about, it has some wireless features in the latest software. The module contains LoRa. What is LoRa and how is it used in the Morserino?
First, yes, wireless features were in from the beginning, really, both Wi-Fi and LoRa. Now, Wi-Fi, everybody knows what that is, and I use it in the Morserino you can use it for updates, for firmware updates, for uploading files, text files, we mentioned those.
Does that mean if I have two or more Morserinos in the same Wi-Fi network, in my own home network, I could actually create a group of Morserinos that communicate with each other?
Yes, you can do it.
Without a server?
Without a server. You even can do this across the internet, point to point. Not a group, it's just two point-to-points.
If you know the destination IP address?
You need the destination IP address, and you have to set up your router normally, because you usually have a firewall, so you have to allow the return traffic coming through to port forwarding. So that's a little bit more complicated. You have to know a little bit about configuring an internet router, but you can do that. But what is easier to do, and what many people do, there are several servers out there, and you can point them, and they are sort of chat relays for the Morserino. You point them to them, and whatever they get, they redistribute to everyone who is listening. And so groups of people can have a QSO like on the ionosphere, so to say. Yeah?
But that would solve the problem of somebody who has an IP address that changes, for example, right?
That's right, yeah. And there's no configuration necessary on your firewall or anything. It just works, yeah.
They could also log into the server. And in that scenario, are there a large number of Morserino users that are getting on these chat groups and communicating?
It's probably not a large group, but there are some. And there are even groups that set up their own server on the internet, which is relatively easy. The code for that is a simple Python script. It's also open source. It was originally written by a ham from Poland, and you can run it on a Raspberry or literally on anything that runs Python. And this is out on the open internet, so to say, or you do it locally in a wide area network with VPNs or whatever. All options, and clubs are setting this up for their training classes, for example, Morse code training class.
So you have the ability to go use LoRa direct between the Morserino devices. If you want to use them, I actually have an unusual circumstance. I have grandchildren that are not connected to anything except the telephone. But one of them is expressing an interest in the Morse code, but is not allowed to be on any network. This is beginning to look interesting as an alternative for them to be able to practice Morse code with me, for example, without being on the internet. So that seems like that's an interesting solution. Also, can I use my Morserino with my old 50-year-old transmitter, for example, because my Kenwood TS520 does not have an electronic keyer in it, and I'd like to use electronic keying. Can I use the Morserino for that?
Yes, of course. Of course, it has an output with it's an optocoupler, which is resistant up to 60 volts. So even tube-based transmitters probably work well.
Or you could use a relay with that.
You could use a relay between, but I think most reasonably modern transmitters wouldn't need it. as it is completely isolated galvanically and is resistant or resists 60 volts. So that should be enough for most purposes.
Right, and that just plugs right into the back.
Yeah, and you just plug it in instead of your key, and you have your Moserino as your keyer. And with the latest, one of the latest versions, it's also a memory keyer. So you have up to, I think, 8 or 10 memories.
CQDX.
For example, it's a bit a challenge to program those. That's not so easy. In some way, you need a computer to program those memories. But there are ways to do that, even for people that are not very technical. And then you have a memory keyer.
Does the Moserino have a web interface? Can I log into it on my network if it's sitting on Wi-Fi and actually program those memory spaces?
Not through a web interface, but you can connect it through USB. It has a serial interface. And there is also some software written by a ham from Austria that runs in a browser. You need a Chrome browser or something that is based on the Chrome engine, because they support serial ports, serial connections. And through the serial connection, you can completely remote control your Moserino on one hand. On the other hand, everything you do on the Moserino is sent to your browser and is sort of displayed on the browser. You can even use it to hear the menus if you don't want to read them on the display of the Moserino. It speaks the menu items for you. We designed that really in order to care for blind hams who would not be able to Moserino because they wouldn't be able to see the menu. So now they hear the menu and they can use the Moserino for practicing, even when they are blind.
I think my Moserino is probably 2 years old. Can I get software or firmware updates for it?
Yes, sure. Yeah, you can go to the Moserino GitHub and download the newest version. You can jump directly from the oldest version to the newest version, so you don't have to go version by version. You just take the newest version and install it.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. And what do you prefer when you're using your Moserino? Do you use your own paddles or do you like to use the capacitive paddles?
Well, I do both, also for testing how they work. I think the paddles work quite well up to, I would say, speeds of maybe 25 words per minute. Some people are using it with 30 words per minute even. If you really go into high speed, above 30 words per minute, then a good high quality mechanical paddle is better.
And as the Moserino creator, do you carry it with you when you go traveling just so that you have your CW companion?
Sometimes I do, but I have to admit something here. My original idea in the very, very beginning, was to build something like that for my own purpose to improve my code. But the irony is the big success of the Moserino prevented me from actually using it.
I hear that.
Because I'm shipping out 120 to 150 kits every month. This is more or less a full-time job now. And when you are retired, you have no time to do a job. You know how it is. So having this job and all the other retirement obligations, it's really tough. Yeah,
I understand that as well.
So I would like to do more with my Morserino, except just testing the software.
I realize that you're probably not on the air as much as you'd probably like to be, but do you have a current rig? What do you operate when you do operate?
Yeah, I have rig, but it's essentially all QRP. As an apartment dweller, I'm very much restricted to setting up antennas. So I'm using makeshift antennas, more or less, experimental stuff, like using the lightning arrestor as an antenna. Quite well, yeah. I wouldn't feed a kilowatt into it. I wouldn't know what it does to all the neighbors in the building. But with QRP, that's fine. And it allowed me to bridge with 5 watts of power to bridge maybe 7,000, 8,000 kilometers.
What's the QRP rig?
I have several. I have an ICOM IC705. I have a Xiego X6100. And my newest acquisition is a QRP Labs QMX Plus. That's the newest one. But you are right. I'm not as much on the air as I would like to be, because the Morserino project costs me a lot of time. Talking about that project, in a way, what is being shipped out now is the second version of the Morserino 32. About, when was it, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I had to do some hardware changes because of the availability of certain parts. The loudspeaker was not available anymore. The module that I'm using that also has the processor, it has changed, and so I had to do a new layout. And now this version is coming to the end of its life after more than 10,000 kits being sold in total, and 10,000 means about 2,500 of the first version, about 7,500 of the second version, because the Heltic module that I'm using is sort of not being manufactured anymore, not available on the market. So the decision that I'm up to is, will there be a third generation of it or not? And this decision will be made later this year. Currently, it looks a bit like it. Yeah, the chances are maybe 66%.
Is the issue for you on creating and selling the Morserino more around the logistics of part accumulation and kitting and all that stuff more than the design itself?
Yes. The design, of course, is fun because you're doing something new all the time, and that's always fun. It's a challenge sometimes, but it's interesting and fun. All the other things, like the logistics, getting parts, I mean, during the pandemic, it was very difficult for a while because all the transport routes were affected, and there were huge delays, and all the electronic companies were hoarding parts, yeah, because the different supply chain issues, so they were just buying things as much as they could, yeah. So that was really hard. And all the kitting is a lot of time, shipping it and do all the logistics around it. So I'm reconsidering all the options here. Right now, I'm checking how much effort is it to do a redesign, because the new version of this module has a lot of changes. It's not binary compatible, so it means do some software porting as well.
It seems to me that, DigiKey started with a keyer. The original DigiKey was like 1969, and that started this billion-dollar parts distribution company as it exists today. It's international. Have you thought about coming up with a collaboration where they actually kit the parts for you? Maybe the case and the board and stuff would have to be supplied. But it seems to me that, wow, in terms of a turnkey parts distribution, kit distribution business, they could do all this work. There's some other people I know that are doing work with DigiKey as well. DigiKey is one of the companies in Israel that I can just order stuff from, and it gets here like in 3 days, which blows me out of the water. There's no problems with the customs, and they do this all over the world. Have you thought about something like that?
Yes, I'm considering things like that, because really the kitting and shipping part is the most time-consuming, it by far, yeah, and the most tiring. I am in discussion with somebody, let's put it that way. I cannot disclose it for now, But discussions are ongoing to find some other way for shipping these things, for shipping the kits out. And hopefully this come to a good end. And if so, and if my decision that the redesign for a new version is not too much effort, then there might be a new version out in 2025. Yeah.
Over 40 years ago, I used to work for a company that made tone boards for two-way radios. The owner was a ham, still is a ham. I think the company still exists. Communication specialist, and Spence Porter WA6TPR was the owner of it. And I once had a conversation with him because he was buying machines to do things. Like if you're going to send out a kit, a tone board kit, well, you had to have like 4 fiber washers, and you had to have 4 bolts, 4 nuts, and you had to have 4 lock washers. And you could hire people to actually sit there with a rubber end of a pencil and separate all that stuff. But he ended up buying these machines that you dump all of the screws in, and the thing would drop all the stuff, the exact number, into a plastic bag, seal the bag, and drop it into a bin. And he says, if you can buy a machine, it works 24/7 and does this work, then it makes this job easier. This seems like the greatest time. We don't have Heathkit anymore, but we do have a lot of companies that are making kit radios. QRP Labs, you're making the Morserino. I know that the Ham Radio Workbench guys have their kits as well, but there's all kinds of kit companies out there. But the worst part about this kit job is kitting. It's the drudgery work. And if you can have a fulfillment house that has all of the machines to separate the resistors and whatever, that was something I learned over 40 years ago. If you could have a machine that does this repetitive, mind-numbing work, then it makes the design part even more interesting.
That's certainly true. And as you said, it's either machines or you have access to very cheap labor, which in certain parts of the world also works quite well.
You're absolutely right that certainly we have the ability to purchase things in the world that are made with very cheap labor. At least in the West, we benefit from that. What is Flipboard Magazine? I see that you're a contributor. I've never heard of Flipboard Magazine before. What is that? Is that like Substack?
Yeah, it's similar. It's essentially just a collection of URLs. Yeah, it presents it as a magazine. And I'm sort of editing a ham radio magazine, so I'm just, if I read something interesting, I'm subscribed to so many blogs and channels. And if I see something that might find a wider interest, I just flip it to the Flipboard. And to the readers, I think you have about 1,700 subscribers to this page, but also occasional things, people who just stumble over it and find a page or one or two. So I think I had quite millions of accesses really to the Flipboard, but about 1,700 subscribers to it. And for me, it's not much. I do no editing or commenting. I see something that is interesting and think, well, that deserves a wider audience. So I flip it there. And the subscribers, they use this as their main source of information, everything about ham radio. So,
right. So you're curating amateur radio content for your followers.
Yes.
Can we go back? The introduction of the Morserino to your makerspace there in Vienna, did that have an effect of attracting younger people to ham radio? Does it have that kind of magnetic effect?
No, I don't think so. It is attractive for hams, but it is not attracting people to ham radio. In general, there are exceptions because there are some people who take the Morserino, for example, to classroom projects. Yeah, and I know a guy who does that regularly once a year. So he goes to his local school, and he has an arrangement with the teachers, and he has given 2 hours, and he explains a little bit about Morse code and the history of Morse code and why people are using Morse code. And then he demonstrates the Morserino, it demonstrates Morse code. They have to learn a few characters or numbers, usually 4 or 5 characters to learn, and they learn them by singing them. So he's singing da-di-da-dit, yeah, and they are repeating. And children learn like that very, very quickly. So within no time, then they have 4, 5, 6 characters. And then he distributes them into 2 classrooms, adjacent classrooms, and gives a mozzarino to each of them. And then one class has to send one character, and the other one has to hear it and send it back. Yeah, and then they send a character of their choice, and the other class has to hear it, decode it, and send it back. And that's interesting for young people. They like that very much. Yeah?
So I thought maybe the Makerspace might be the place to attract young people to amateur radio. But do you have any thoughts? Is there something that we could do better to attract young people to amateur radio from an Austrian perspective?
Yeah, I think there are 2 areas. Schools. We have, I think now in Vienna, at least 2 or 3 schools where they have a ham radio station and a teacher who is interested and offers classes and projects with them. Schools are one area where you can attract people. Makerspaces in general, at least here in Austria, are not very good at attracting very young people. Most people that are attracted by Makerspace are already at university level. Usually 18, 19, 20 years old and older, rarely any younger.
And do makerspaces attract people like they live in apartments and therefore can't have a power shop in their house?
Yeah, of course, yeah. You have no room for your 3D printer or laser cutter or whatever, so you go there. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. And I mean, the other reason, you find sort of like-minded people. Yeah, that's the same kind of attraction that amateur radio clubs had, at least in the past. Yeah, you find like-minded people. I think within ham radio, we have become a bit bad about that. Yeah, as ham radio clubs, we are not attracting people anymore. Rarely. That's my observation, that many clubs are more or less, they're a bunch of friends who meet regularly, maybe once a month or something like that. They meet for a beer or pizza or whatever. But if an outsider joins them, they hardly talk to them. Yeah, they don't explain anything. They are not inviting them to any activities. Yeah, and that's a shame, really, because that would be also a way to attract people. And honestly, there are 2 groups of people that you can attract: young people when they go to school and university. They might find the time and they are easy and eager to learn new things. And the other group is people who are maybe close to their retirement because they are looking for a new hobby for the time when they are retired.
I've actually seen this lately, in some of the interviews that I've made, that retired people, there's a social opportunity that lends itself with amateur radio for retired people. And then it's even more valuable when they become widowed, that they still have some way of communicating with the outside world. And, I rely upon my wife, Karen, to keep the social life going. She runs the social calendar. And I can only imagine that if she wasn't around, would I have a social calendar? And it's my amateur radio connections that actually draw me out of the house on my own. I can see that there's a huge value in amateur radio for retired and older people. I'm jumping around, and I apologize to the listeners, but you have such an interesting background, and you do so much that I want to make sure that I touch on this. You are now on a committee at the ARDC. The ARDC is the organization that used to be AmpereNet. They dole out money for amateur radio projects that meet their grant criteria. Could you talk a little bit about what you're doing now on the ARDC?
Yes, I'm a member of what they call the Grant Evaluation Team. So this team looks at projects that have been granted and have been finished. And we look at how the project went from the very beginning. What did they apply for? Why did they apply for it? How did they apply for it? How did the project develop? How did it end? Were all the objectives met? Was it a good project to be funded? Or was it questionable? Was it successful? success is very difficult to define here, because even a project that fails can be successful in a way, because it is always an opportunity for learning. Yeah, for the people who did the project, they learned, they failed, but they learned a lot even when failing. Yeah, so failure is not really a very strong criteria, except if you publish nothing of your project. If nothing is published and there is no way to learn anything from it, then it was really a failure. But those are very, very rare. In most cases, even if they did not achieve all the objectives written out when they applied for the grant, they usually achieve a lot, and they learned from the failings as well. And things, many have set up websites or other ways, presentations of what they did and how they did it. So that's all very useful. And we are sort of evaluating that and also giving feedback to the ARDC board and to their grant advisory committee to improve the way how grants are being spread around the globe. The ARDC wants to be as inclusive as possible, inclusive in all ways, inclusive with regard to gender, with regard to race, ethnicity, etc. Geographically, it started originally in the US, and it's still very US-centric, but there is a lot of effort going on to spread the word outside the US as well, and to include as many people as possible and many clubs, etc.
One of the things it occurs to me, by spreading these opportunities around the world, it also protects the radio spectrum that we so zealously guard, that we've had for 100 years. Because there's a lot of large corporate interests around the world that would love to have the spectrum that we have.
Of course, yeah.
Both HF and all the way through the microwave band. So I think that this is very powerful. Do you think that with this feedback that you're giving the ARDC, is ARDC now able to, say, help define the implementation of a grant project, meaning that it can provide a framework for tracking the goals of the granted project and how that is implemented and reported?
Yeah, I think they always had some kind of framework, but with these things, especially if you start something new, and this was a very new thing in the beginning, there's always room for improvement. Yeah, and it's a continuous process to improve things and to refocus on certain areas and say, well, we also look at what is the public impact of a project, for example. What is the exposure of a project to the general public? Yeah, and we have seen some projects with a huge exposure when people are doing things at huge fairs, for example, with 10,000s of visitors. Then you have a huge audience that you can reach possibly, or others are doing things in connection with emergency networks, setting up mobile stations, radio towers, repeaters, and explaining to the public and to maybe the organizations like the Red Cross or the firefighters, etc., explaining to them what amateur radio can do in the case of a disaster. Yeah? And that's very helpful, I think, also for the general awareness. And we need a lot of general awareness, general public awareness, if we want to protect our spectrum. Yeah,
I think so. I begin the podcast usually with ham radio. Do people still do that? Because there are many times when I'm out in the public, whether it's in the United States or here in Israel. In Israel, we call it Chovevi radio, radio of friends. It's friends radio. And people will go, well, I remember that from the 60s, or I remember that from the 70s, but do people still do that? I mean, that's almost a universal reaction to when you say that you still do amateur radio. I like to say ham radio is more exciting now than it's ever been. The Morserino is a good example of this combination of being able to integrate these technologies to create something really interesting and spectacular. But we're doing that on every front, and the Internet gives us this ability to move at hyper speed in terms of advancing the state of the art, when the turnaround time could be a year on an idea years ago. Now we do it in minutes, which makes it even more exciting. But I think that for some reason, We are not communicating to the general public that we are still here and that we're more relevant than ever. I've had this idea in my mind that I need to write a column for the ARP magazine, which is American Advancement of Retired People. It's a magazine for old people. You start getting it at 52 years of age or something like that. It has great articles in it, but I've never seen an article about amateur radio, and it seems like it's the prescription for a lot of what ails us when we're older. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now, beyond the Morserino?
I would say it's all the possibilities we have with getting very new, very low price or extremely low price equipment through SDR, etc. And if you look at the transceivers of QRP Labs, you for $100 or $150, you get technology marvel that would have cost thousands of dollars 10 to 20 years ago. And it wouldn't have the features that you have now in even these tiniest machines, like a LCD display and things like that. So the combination with modern technology, microprocessors, etc., that's very exciting. Also, what I find interesting is that through things like, for example, Reverse Beacon Network, Whisper, PSK Reporter, we have so many means now to observe the propagation conditions around the globe. That was very difficult 20, 25, 30 years ago. You had to go out and try to establish a connection by calling CQ, and then you would see if it would work into a certain area of the world or it wouldn't. But now you just glance at your screen on your computer and you know exactly what's going on. It also has a downside, of course, because people are not calling CQ anymore.
You can profile an antenna now with WhisperNet.
Exactly. And all the tools we have with our computers, what we can do, like antenna modeling in theory before you build something, also doing electronics modeling before you build something. So it's also exciting, I think, for home brewers. That's also something I think we should preach a bit more to people, not just to buy some plug-and-play equipment, but go out and build something yourself, even if a simple wire-based antenna or whatever, a simple electronics project. Try to do something yourself. I think that's an important message also to our ham colleagues,
Would that be the advice that you would give not only to your ham colleagues, but to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I would. Do something, build something. Even if it's simple, doesn't have to be a transceiver with all bells and whistles. Get some kits. You mentioned it already. There are so many kits out there for all sorts of things. Get something, just try it out, build something with an Arduino or some other microprocessor. There are also kits out there for that. You can experiment. It's so cost effective. It doesn't cost anything really. It's a few beers give you a microprocessor and a display and things to play with,
You can afford to burn a few of them up.
Yeah, that's right.
Because they're not expensive.
They're not expensive, All these electronic parts, they are so cheap nowadays. And I think that's certainly one of the, that's an advice I would give everybody. The other thing is find a group of young enthusiasts like a makerspace and go there. It's really inspiring just to see, even if it's not completely focused on ham radio, even if you just talk about laser cutters or 3D printers. These are all things that are also useful in our hobby, by the way. You can build cases, you can build lots of things that are useful. And just to learn something new, how these things work, they are just inspiring. And I think finding young people that are enthusiastic about these things is also good advice. A third advice is, it was actually something that is exciting for me as a ham, is the fact that even the oldest technology like Morse code is alive and actually growing. That's my impression. People are getting more interested in it. Although it is that old, the oldest electronic communication technology, if you want. And I want to tell a little story here, because when I tell people that I do the Morserino and people that are not hams maybe, they say, well, are people actually really using Morse code? And I said, yes, yeah, and there are not there are quite a few, really. And I said, but commercially, Morse code isn't being used. Doesn't matter if it's airplanes, ships, whatever. Nobody's using Morse code. I said, yeah, in a way, commercially, it is not being used. That is true. But sailing boats are not used commercially. And I'm sure you know people who go out sailing. Why are they doing this? Why are people going out sailing when the propeller and the engine has been invented and you can buy a motorboat? Why are they going out and do sailing? Because it is fun.
Or why do they buy a mountain bike when they can buy an e-bike?
Right. It is fun. It is a challenge. You have to learn it. In the beginning, it is hard. But once you master it, and even if you are not yet a master, but just along the way, if you've made some progress, that's satisfying. And that's fun. And that's why people are doing it. And that's why people are still using ham radio and why they're still using Morse code. Because it is fun.
Well, I get the impression that the Morse code is more popular now is because I think that, at least for me, I'm continually bombarded by either audible information or visual information. I mean, when you have a smartphone and you've got the internet and stuff, your brain is on overload. And right now here in Israel with the war going on, we're being fed information on a minute-by-minute basis. It's stressful. And what I find about the Morse code is that it's kind of like it separates your brain from the rest of the noise. And I think even if you're in America or you're in Austria, if you like the Morse code, it's because it's a way to kind of like, there's a zen about it. There's like a meditation about the Morse code.
That's right. You focus on something and you focus on that and nothing else, yeah?
Right, and it's good for your brain. Again, for older people, maybe it'll delay dementia, which may be inevitable for all of us if we live long enough, but maybe it's a way to kind of keep those neurons firing in our brains as we get older.
Yeah, I absolutely agree to that, yeah.
Willi, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I knew this would be fun. I'm so glad that you agreed to talk to me about you and about the Morserino. I know that I'll get some very good feedback from this episode. So I appreciate it so much that you came on board.
It was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation.
73.
73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Willi. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in OE1WKL in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.